At 1:12 after midnight, the glass ceiling of the Manhattan Exchange Hall glowed cold blue above a river of suits and sequins, as cameras drifted like patient insects and stock prices pulsed live across a wall of light. And Nathan Blackwood stood beneath it with a crystal tumbler in his hand, answering a reporter as if love were an outdated software patch. His voice calm, his smile thin, until he said it softly and clearly that he would marry anyone who could play the saxophone better than the soul his engineers had taught a machine to fake tonight there. The room answered with staged laughter and a ripple of phones as the ticker behind him jumped green, as if the market itself approved the joke. Glasses clinked a woman in diamonds, touched his sleeve, and at the far edge of the bar where temporary staff were meant to disappear into black vests and silence, Lena Morales felt the words land like a name called across water, her fingers tightening around a tray as the polished brass of a display saxophone caught the light and reflected a version of her she had buried years ago without sound, without mercy tonight. She stepped away from the bar before courage could decay, and a security guard moved first, blocking her path with a flat palm as the event manager hissed through his headset that she would be fired and blacklisted from every contracted shift in the city. But the threat slid past her as if it belonged to someone else, and she lifted her chin, once asking for nothing, as the crowd turned curious, then amused, then mildly cruel. In that way wealth learns by practice. Someone laughed loudly. Another filmed closer. A guard swore softly. A camera found her face. Finally, she walked anyway, past the guard, past the warning, past the idea of tomorrow, and lifted the saxophone from its stand with hands that remembered weight and heat, despite the years of refusal. And when she set the reed to her mouth, the last pockets of laughter fell away, as if the air itself had taken a step back, the first note sliding low and rough before finding its center and opening into a sound that felt less like music than truth. The room leaned forward, breaths caught a glass, shook once in a trembling hand, and then steadied again. Nathan felt the shock not in his ears but behind his ribs, as if the sound had reached for him without permission and found something unarmored, his confident posture locking his breath, hitching once as investors set their drinks down in unison, and the live numbers on the wall stuttered for a heartbeat, because the machine he trusted to imitate sorrow never trembled like this, and the woman he had not looked at twice was turning him into an unanswered question, a question that the market could not price, that the cameras could not script, that his life had avoided. When she finished, there was no flourish, no bow, no apology, only the soft click of keys returning to rest as she lowered the instrument and set it back, where it did not belong, and walked off through a gap that opened in the crowd without being offered the silence following her, not as admiration, but as shock, and only then did whispers start, as reporters checked feeds and someone somewhere labeled her already as the waitress who dared the billionaire, a stranger reduced to a headline before anyone knew her name, before she could take 5 safe breaths outside. Outside, she leaned against concrete, shaking as the cold reached places. The lights had ignored, and her phone buzzed with a supervisor message that confirmed what the threat had promised, while inside Nathan remained motionless long after sound returned to the room, and his aides asked if he was all right, because something in him finally named what he had seen. Not rebellion, not ambition, but survival, the kind that burns through rules, when rules have been built on forgetting, built on profit, on spectacle, on games that forgot the cost of a human voice breaking open in public view. By the time he moved, the clip was already migrating from private phones toward the public bloodstream, and a joke had become a wager, with names attached, and though he did not yet know hers, he felt the certainty settle that he would look for it and make the mistake he always made of trying to control what had undone him. While somewhere on a back stair, Lena wiped her face and told herself she had done the one thing she was never meant to do, and survived it barely. Outside the gala, the city kept breathing as if nothing. By the time dawn thinned the dark over Queens, the diner sign hummed back to life, and Lena took her place at the end of the counter with a cup of coffee. She did not taste the floor still ringing faintly in her bones from a sound she had sworn never to make again, and customers slid into cracked vinyl seats with the ordinary hunger of people who worked through the night, none of them knowing how close she had come to evaporating under light and lenses only hours before. The bell over the door chimed and she flinched now. Her manager, Raoul, watched from the grill with a look that mixed relief and warning, and when the rush settled, he told her low that cameras had called the place twice already, and he could not have trouble following her inside these walls. Not unkind, not cruel, but careful in the way small owners must be when storms chase payroll, and Lena nodded because survival had taught her to accept the limits of other people long before she learned the limits of her own breath. A trucker cleared his throat as if to punctuate the moment, then ordered eggs and, between refills, she slipped into memory, the way one steps off a curb without looking, and the street rose around her with summer heat and the rasp of a battered horn where her father once played for strangers, who dropped coins or curses, his fingers agile even when his promises were not. And she was small, then counting stars in the bell, while he taught her how breath becomes sound, and sound becomes a hand someone else can hold. By 12, she could outpace him, and by 14, outrun the grief that waited at home. It never stopped following her. The night the call came, she was on a borrowed stage miles away, playing louder and faster, because her father was late, and lateness had always been the rehearsal for disaster. And when the siren cut through the music like a blade, she kept playing because the audience clapped, and obedience had a voice that sounded like duty. Then the hall emptied into a quiet that told her the truth before any words could. He never arrived, and the road kept what the bottle had already claimed, leaving her with a mouth full of metal and blame. She learned to. After the funeral, she packed the sax in a case that still smelled of spit and brass, and slid it beneath a bed that never felt like hers, and built a new language out of cups and plates, and the careful math of tips, learning the rhythm of strangers instead of scales, learning how to smile without promise, learning how not to be asked questions that would open doors she had sealed with both palms. At night, she rode the bus until the city loosened its grip, and the sound in her chest dimmed to a whisper, enough to sleep. Queens taught her endurance through fluorescent hours, and the names of men who mistook patience for invitation through jokes that landed heavy and hands that lingered long enough to test the meaning of a room full of witnesses. And she learned to pivot with a tray as a shield and a voice that stayed level, because level voices cost less afterward. Sometimes she left early with a head full of static and the promise that tomorrow would be quieter, and sometimes tomorrow arrived with the same argument in different shoes. She saved what she could and spent what she must. By mid-morning, a courier dropped an envelope from a network she did not recognize, and Raoul slid it into the trash without opening it, while Lena wiped the counter and felt the room tilt with the idea that her name might be traveling without her consent, across rooms she would never be invited to enter again. A customer mentioned the gala as gossip, and she kept her face blank because blank faces are doors with better locks when the world grows curious. Her phone stayed dark, and she told herself that darkness was mercy. For a while it almost worked. The belief that being seen brings loss did not arrive as a sentence, but as weather that returned without asking, and she dressed for it every day in neutral colors, and distance careful, never to let another person stand where music once stood in her chest. The diner gave her a smaller horizon that fit the rule, and she learned each crack in the counter as if it were a map, each voice, as if it were a tide she could read for storms and safe return. Still the echo followed her in the cool between cups again and again. When a teenage server whispered that a clip was spreading, Lena felt heat climb her spine and tasted salt as if the sound had turned physical again, and she asked Raoul if she still had a shift tomorrow, and he said yes with a question in his eyes that told her yes could change. She nodded as if jobs were breaths that could be held then released, and went back to pouring coffee for men whose names she would never know, but whose habits she could predict with closed eyes. Outside, a bus hissed, and the city practiced forgetting fast. By the end of the shift, her hands steadied, and the idea of hiding returned as muscle memory, but it no longer fit the same way it once had, and she did not know whether that was freedom or danger, only that the note she had released could not be called back, and the world would answer it in its own language soon. She clocked out into pale sun and the thin hope that surviving one impossible choice might teach her how to survive the next. Across the river market would be opening, and she did not know it yet. Nathan did not return to the penthouse with the feeling of victory that usually followed an appearance like that, because nothing in the night would organize itself around profit or applause the way it always had, and the glass walls that usually gave him the comfort of distance now reflected a man who had said something careless and watched it turn into a doorway he did not know how to close. The saxophone sound stayed with him not as melody, but as interruption, cutting into the quiet routines of screens and forecasts, and the calibrated sleep his doctor insisted on. And when he lay back, with the city floating beneath him, he realized that the moment he froze had not been a pause, but a rupture in a life designed to avoid rupture at all cost. By 3 a.m, he gave the order he had promised himself he would never give again, the one that bent other people's days toward his own question. Without asking, instructing an assistant to pull security feeds for the gala and identify the woman with the saxophone, a request passed down through layers of compliance with neutral words and fast hands. When the first still image appeared on his private screen, he felt the old reflex return, the comfort of control stitched into his pulse, and he did not yet know that this reflex would be the hand that tipped the first stone. The venue system flagged unusual access within the hour as departments cross-checked badge logs and rental contracts. And what began as a private curiosity rippled outward through companies that survived on proximity to his attention, And somewhere in that web, a junior technician sent a clip to a friend who sent it to another with the careless generosity of people who do not imagine consequences larger than a small bright screen. By dawn, the image had learned to travel on its own. Nathan learned about the spread at 8:30, when the assistant arrived with too steady a voice and an apology built into the pauses, telling him that the clip had left controlled channels and was accelerating across platforms with commentary that ranged from reverent to cruel, and that several outlets had already requested statements. He stood at the window and watched the river slide past, as if his gaze could slow anything at all, and told himself that this was not his doing because he had not posted it and had not told anyone to publish yet. The truth pressed close enough to fog the glass because he had created the conditions, and the conditions always mattered more than the story people told afterward. The first headline framed it as a dare, answered the second as a fairy tale, the third as a trap, and the words Waitress and Billionaire began to appear side by side with a familiarity that erased the human shape beneath both labels. By 10, his investor relations director insisted on a response to stabilized narrative, and Nathan refused, not because he had found his better self overnight, but because the idea of shaping her into a narrative felt like another theft layered on the first, and the refusal cost him more seconds of attention than he could recoup by the end of the day. His phone lit again in the mid-morning calm with a message from a network that had never waited for permission to speculate, and he turned it face down without reading, while his board chair left a voice message that sounded like concern wrapped around caution. He moved through meetings as if underwater, listening for the thin rattle that meant fear had found a new point of purchase, hearing it in the way partners asked questions that were not questions, and in the way his former fiancée sent a short clipped text that carried a history he had chosen to end in the safest way he knew, by disengaging before feeling could demand something riskier than certainty. By noon, the name he had asked for arrived without context, and he stared at it longer than he meant to, as if staring could turn fact into misunderstanding, and returned the file unopened to a folder he did not intend to touch again, though he did. He told himself he only wanted to be sure she was not harmed by the wave he had helped raise, and that the knowledge was a form of duty, not desire, but his hands on the desk were not steady enough to persuade his body. When the markets flinched on rumors that he had orchestrated the spectacle as product theater, he lost a contract he had worked 2 years to secure, and his chief financial officer asked in a low, measured voice whether this distraction would pass before the quarter closed, and Nathan answered yes, because he always answered yes to the future, as if the future were a tool and not a field where mistakes germinated unseen. The word mistake landed heavier in the afternoon as messages stacked, and he saw at last the comment that stung, because it was simplest and therefore hardest to argue with, which was that he had made a joke out of a life that needed no witnesses to be real, and all the data he owned could not tell him what to do with that sentence. He replayed the moment she lifted the instrument with a steadiness that refused the category of bravado, and felt himself shrink inside the memory, not with shame alone, but with the knowledge that his reflex had been to frame the event the instant it escaped him, to make a puzzle of it, so that puzzles could be solved and therefore possessed. This reflex had ended his engagement without a fight, when his partner asked what his plans for their fear were, and he answered with a timeline instead of a hand. by evening he sat alone in the office with lights dimmed and the city stitched in weather outside, and acknowledged the shape of what he had done, without indulging the fiction of accident, and the acknowledgment did not redeem him, but it named the cost of reach without consent, and attention without humility. When he finally allowed himself to open the file with her name at the top, he stopped after the first line and closed it again, because he had learned that looking too closely too soon was another form of taking, and he did not yet trust the part of himself that wanted to take. The clip crossed 1,000,000 views as he rose to leave, and he felt the hollow certainty that the harm of the first night would not be measured by numbers, but by the space it had carved in 2 lives that had not asked to be braided, and in this knowledge there was no triumph, only the quiet terror of realizing that for the first time control had not merely failed to protect him, but had become the blade that cut the future open. Nathan chose the bus because it was the one place his presence collapsed into ordinary weight and smell and impatience, and a seat that did not belong to him until he claimed it with a quiet nod, and he rode it past neighborhoods. His car windows had translated into maps without texture until Queens rose up in low brick and tired neon, and the diner appeared exactly as the assistant's note had promised, a bright rectangle of light against morning gray, where people practiced the small rituals that keep a day from unraveling. Inside, the bell chimed, and the air carried grease and coffee, and the soft argument of utensils against plates. And for the first time in weeks, no one angled a lens at him, and no one adjusted posture to match a rank they assumed he held. And he slid into a booth at the back, with a laminated menu that stuck lightly to his palm, like something meant to be cleaned later. Lena did not look up when he entered, because the rule that had kept her steady since dawn was to treat curiosity like smoke and leave the room until it thinned. But Raoul saw him and stiffened in a way that told her this was not another trucker or a teenager killing time before class. And when she reached his table with a pot of coffee, she recognized him from the shape of his silence. Before she recognized his face, the shock moved through her in a controlled way, like a ripple contained in a narrow glass, and she asked what he wanted without lifting her eyes. And he ordered what the man in the next booth ordered, because he did not trust himself with choice yet. A customer 2 stools down muttered something about rich men slumming, and the word billionaire landed in the room with a weight it did not earn because there was no stage here to support it. And before Nathan could smooth the moment, Lena set the coffee down harder than necessary and looked at the man who had spoken with a clear calm that felt sharper than anger, and asked if he needed anything else, or if he was done making noise. And the man flushed and turned back to his eggs with a theater of indifference that fooled no one. The moment lingered between them, not as gratitude, but as a fact that would need to be placed somewhere. And for a breath, Nathan was not sure whether the fact was that she had defended him or that she had defended the space itself from becoming another room where a story swallowed a person. He ate without tasting again, and listened to the way she moved the floor with the confidence of someone who knows the grammar of a room and expects it to respond. And in the small exchanges with regulars, he saw the version of himself that had disappeared under the convenience of title, the one that had once learned names, not as assets but as threads. When she returned with his check, she set it down without flourish and met his eyes at last in a look that was neither invitation nor rebuke, only a boundary drawn with attention. And he paid and tipped with a hand that did not perform, because performance could not belong here without breaking something. Outside the light had shifted, and rain threatened without commitment, and he stood under the awning longer than he intended. Because leaving felt like repeating an old pattern of entrances without consequences. Sighed, Lena watched him through the glass, as if he were a caption she refused to read, and told herself that this visit meant nothing, because meaning had a habit of charging interest she could not afford. The next night he came again at an hour when the diner thinned into pockets of insomnia, and the way he slid into the same booth made it harder to pretend this was accident. And a pair of cab drivers argued softly about routes and pay, and one of them asked her if she knew the man in the back, and she said customer because the word was a shield that fit. A teenager with chipped nail polish flirted careless with Nathan out of boredom, and the look that crossed his face was not refusal, but confusion at being read as a type again, and he declined with thanks, and eyes that drifted back to the counter, where Lena was stacking cups with a rhythm that betrayed more than she wanted anyone to notice. The jealousy he felt then surprised him with its heat, because it did not touch ownership so much as proximity, and he did not yet have language for that distinction. When the girl laughed and moved on, Lena did not look up, but her mouth tightened for the length of a breath she would later tell herself she had not marked, and the room returned to the low churn of night business that neither of them fully inhabited. Over the next days, he kept coming without the armor of entourage, and she kept serving without the protection of anonymity. Because the clip had made that costly, and the space between them filled with the ordinary trust of people who see one another at the same hour for reasons that are not named. He learned the way the cook swore under his breath when the grill flared, and she learned the habit of his hand that traced lines on the table as if finding a code that did not need to be solved. And once when a man mistook her patience for consent and caught her wrist in a gesture meant to test public limits, Nathan stood quicker than his thought, and the look he gave said that some maps end at stone, and Raoul arrived on the beat with a warning, and the man released as if he had lost interest first. Afterward, Lena's pulse shook against her skin, and she said you did not have to do that without accusation, and he answered, I know, without defense, and the words sat between them like a bridge they could cross or leave for later. No one revealed him, and no one asked again who he was, because queens had a long practice of letting strangers be what they said they were, and in that permission the threads that had drawn him here loosened from curiosity into something quieter. On the sixth night the power flickered, and the room breathed out together as if a shared animal, and in the half-dark Nathan heard the city without its mask for the first time in years, and Lena steadied a spilling tray with a laugh that came out as a sound she did not rehearse, and when the light returned, he felt the first honest relief he could remember without attaching a number to it. Across the room the bell chimed and the rain began at last, and the space between them learned a new shape that neither of them named, but both felt as a question that asked to be lived rather than solved. The first true quiet between them arrived on a night when the rain fell straight down and the plexiglass hum of the diner flattened into a low, steady breath. and Nathan sat with his hands folded the way he had learned to do, in rooms where speaking early meant losing later, while Lena moved between tables with a tired grace that had begun to include him without asking permission, and the looks they exchanged were no longer accidental, but careful in the way people test depth with the tip of a shoe before committing weight. When the power dipped, the room answered with a soft collective sound, and the emergency lights brushed everything amber, and in that altered color, the distance between their edges shifted as if the shadows had negotiated for them. And Lena stepped faster to the counter with a tray that had grown slick with condensation. She slipped on the corner of a rubber mat that had curled at the edge, and the fall happened at the speed of surprise. And Nathan was out of the booth before the sound of her breath finished leaving her mouth, his hands catching her forearms with a steadiness that felt like intention rather than reflex. And the tray clattered as cups chimed like apology around their feet. For a second they were held in the posture of a different story, with his hands where only gravity had planned, and her balance returning through him rather than the floor, and the first touch landed not as heat, but as recognition that startled them both into stillness. She felt the tremor that his stillness disguised, and he felt the way her pulse counted backward from fear into anger, into something that did not yet trust a name. And Raoul cleared his throat from the grill, as if to stitch the room back together, while a regular joked too loudly that it was not a dance floor, and the moment folded into work again without breaking entirely. Lena straightened and said thanks with the voice she used to settle small spills, and Nathan nodded with the focus of a man returning a borrowed object before anyone could ask for it. But the silence between them had changed texture, and neither of them could lean on the old version of it without noticing the difference. Later that same night, a man at the far booth drank past the precision that keeps words social, and his attention decided that Lena was the kind of problem that could be entertained until it became expensive, and he spoke her into a joke that pulled the room sideways, and when she corrected him with a practiced lightness that invited repair only to have it refused, Nathan felt a tightening he did not choose. He stood when the man stood, and the space between them learned the shape of risk, and the man saw in Nathan a limit he had not accounted for, and weighed it badly before laughing and sitting again as if he had completed the exchange he intended. Lena met Nathan at the counter with a look that asked what he thought he was doing without spelling it, and he answered by leaning his palms against the laminate, as if setting down a weight he did not yet know how to carry. And they both breathed in the relief that comes when danger decides to move on without payment. In the equal quiet that followed, jealousy crept between them with a different mask, and when a college boy with the soft courage of borrowed certainty flirted his way into a refill and lingered longer than the cup required, Nathan felt the slow burn that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the fear of being replaceable, and he hated the fear for how it named him. Lena saw the look cross his face and misread it as contempt for the room that had kept her employed, and the muscles in her back hardened around a story she had learned to protect. And when the boy left with a careless wave, she set the next order down with an edge she did not mean to sharpen. He caught it and mistook it for distance, and answered with the one weapon he trusted, which was restraint. and for 2 days they circled each other with politeness, sharp enough to draw a line no one asked for. On the 3rd night, the tension cured into honesty. When the freezer door stuck, and Lena needed a body with leverage rather than apology, and they wrestled the stubborn hinge together with laughter, born of irritation, until it released with a sound like agreement, and the cold breathed them both into shiver. And in that small teamwork, the question that had no language relaxed its grip. Afterwards, they sat on overturned crates for a minute, with the hum of equipment filling the words they did not risk yet, and she said he surprised her, and he said she did too, and neither of them rushed to explain. The rain ended, and the city returned to its practiced indifference, while something in each of them counted the losses differently, and found one of them lighter. The first touch did not become a sentence or a promise that night, but it left a punctuation mark they both heard when the bell chimed again, and the door opened to the rest of the world that was not yet theirs to claim. The night her past caught up with her did not announce itself with thunder or confession, but arrived on the back of a face she had learned to avoid in mirrors. A man who stood at the counter with rain on his shoulders and the smell of old smoke in his jacket, and a way of looking at the room that measured the exits before it measured the people. Lena saw him in reflection, first in the chrome of the coffee machine, and felt the old cold start at the base of her spine that did not care how many years had passed, and she moved 2 steps to the right to give Raoul a clearer line of sight without making it a scene. The man ordered black coffee and said her name softly as if it were a test, and she set the cup down with care she did not feel, and answered him with the neutrality she had built from practice, asking if there would be anything else and keeping her eyes on the rim. He said not tonight, and smiled the way people smile when they believe the room owes them a version of itself they once touched, and Nathan watched from his booth without knowing why the air had tightened except that it had. On the 3rd refill, the man asked if she still carried a horn, and Lena felt the floor slip the way it had under her foot. That other night, only this time there were no hands to catch her, because this fall was internal, and the room did not know how to see it. She shook her head once and said she did not know what he meant, and he laughed with a lack of cruelty that still cut because it assumed a shared memory she had spent a decade locking out. He said her father used to say the same thing on nights when the bottle was kinder than the truth, and that he had watched her grow from the edge of a stage where she played too loud for a girl her size and too honest for men who wanted to forget themselves cheaply. The words tore open a door she had reinforced with sleep and habit, and Lena felt the whole of the diner tilt into the corridor of a past she had catalogued for survival, but never revisited without payment. Raoul asked if there was a problem, and the man said none at all as long as he could finish his coffee and leave with the story intact that he had not been erased from theirs, and Nathan stood without asking permission because something in the static of the room had organized into alarm. The man noticed him then and looked him over with a calculus he believed would land in his favor, and said quietly that family business was not for spectators. And Lena heard in the phrase the excuse she had used for years to keep people at arm length, the idea that blood absolves damage when it can only explain it. She told the man flatly that family had been laid in the ground, and that he could drink or go but not speak again about what did not belong to him, and her voice shook not with fear, but with the cost of saying it. The man tipped back the last of the coffee and stood too close and said, "Grief made people sharp," but it did not give them ownership of a truth that had paid him in music once. And Nathan set a hand between them at a distance that named a limit without naming a threat, and for a breath the room waited to see which story would be chosen. The man chose departure with the performance of dignity that follows retreat, and the bell answered his exit with a sound that felt like release. Lena did not breathe until he was gone, and then the breath unstitched her carefully sewn posture, and she turned away with hands that did not know where to go. Now that work had been named as something else entirely, and Nathan followed at a distance, she did not have the strength to negotiate. In the narrow hall by the restrooms, she pressed her palms to the cool tile and closed her eyes as if the chill could pass through her into the place that burned. And when she spoke, her voice came out quieter than work allowed, but louder than memory had ever tolerated. She said that the man had played with her father in a band that lived from one unreliable promise to the next, and that some nights she had counted sirens instead of stars, and that she had learned to pack her horn without packing hope, because hope had a way of calling men back to rooms where nothing had changed except the stain. Nathan said nothing because he had learned that immediacy was not always kindness, and the restraint steadied her enough to continue. She said the night her father died, he had promised to come clean and sober to hear her play, and that she had believed him because believing had kept her upright through entire winters of waiting, and that the call had come with the sound of rain and metal, and a road that did not forgive choices made twice. Nathan felt the shape of the story before the end because some parallels announced themselves without invitation, and he did not interrupt when she said she had kept playing through the sirens because the audience had demanded, and the demand had sounded like permission to postpone her own breaking until it could be made useful. The truth fell between them as a practical object, not a performance, and she said she had not touched the saxophone since, because some promises are too loud to be kept in any other register than silence. And when the tears arrived, they were not violent but persistent, as if an old door had finally been opened to air. Nathan moved one step closer and stopped, because proximity is a language both people must agree to speak, and she surprised them both by reaching for his sleeve with a grip that borrowed steadiness without apology. She did not apologize for crying, and he did not reach for solutions, and the exchange felt for the first time like a mutual contract rather than a rescue. In the kitchen, Raoul turned a page in a ledger he did not need to read, and pretended not to hear the uneven quiet that had replaced their usual efficiency, and the room learned a new patience that night without anyone naming it. When Lena finally stepped back, her face had settled into a tired calm that did not ask to be fixed, and she said she would finish the shift, and he nodded because choosing was a dignity he would not violate. They returned to the floor, and the hour folded in on itself, with the familiar traffic of seats and orders, and with each exchange she steadied as if the words she had spilled had been weight she no longer had to carry alone. When the counter emptied and the bell chimed, for the last time she looked at Nathan across the room and said he did not have to come back, and he answered without flourish that he would anyway. And in the space between those sentences, something old loosened and something untrained took its first careful step. The day the video broke into the open behaved at first like any other with unfamiliar numbers, sliding across screens, and strangers practicing certainty in comments they would not remember owning. And Lena learned about it not from a call or a knock, but from the way the room subtly reoriented around her, as if gravity had been recalculated and everyone else had felt the shift before she did. A woman at the counter turned her phone slightly, as if sharing weather, and the image froze there between syrup and napkin, the same angle, the same forbidden light, the same unchosen sound shaping the air around her again. And the caption settled over the room like a verdict that asked to be repeated. And when the word gold digger appeared for the third time in a line of scrolling faces, Lena felt the floor go distant, as if the city had quietly stepped back from her feet. By noon, the requests stacked like plates in a rush from outlets she had never watched, from agents she had never needed, from people who wanted a piece of a person they had assembled from seconds and opinions. And Raoul moved through the diner with his jaw set, as if bracing for weather he could not name, while telling her with an apology in his eyes that a reporter was outside and another had called his wife at home. She told him she would go out the back, and he nodded with relief and fear equal in measure, because a small business does not survive a story that eats everything it touches. She did not see Nathan that day because she had already decided that seeing him would tilt the day into a sentence she could not survive, and she took the bus without paying and rode until the route forgot her and delivered her to a street where no one recognized the shape of her silence. The lies grew faster than the truth, because lies always do when they are given good bones. And by evening, a rumor had chosen a narrative that fit the appetite of people who prefer their cause and effect to be theater rather than weather. They said she had planned it for months, that she had waited for a rich man to speak a foolish sentence, and stepped into it like a door that had been built for her. And they said she had practiced innocence, the way others practice scales, and each word found an audience that did not know her face well enough to make it human. The former fiancé appeared by nightfall in an interview that chose phrasing like a blade, and smiled with a practiced sorrow that sold the idea that some women mistake attention for love, and make men pay for the misunderstanding, and the comment took root because it confirmed a prejudice that moved easily through air already warmed by money and envy. Nathan watched the escalation from an office that had never felt so far from consequence, and made the mistake he would rehearse and regret by staying silent for the hour it took strategy to assemble, and the silence did as much harm as any lie, because it sounded like agreement when people were already certain they had found a villain who fit their hand. By the time he spoke publicly, with a statement that refused labels and refused the story that had been written for him, the damage had made its first migrations and found Lena's name where he had hoped it would not, and the night learned her address through a kindness that had not been kind at all. A brick struck the window of the laundromat downstairs without precision or message, except that someone wanted a sound to answer their anger, and the sound obliged with clean glass and the fright of neighbors who had not chosen any part of this theater. Lena stayed in her room with the lights off and the phone face down, and her breath counting the dark in ways that felt like the beginning of a panic she would not name. And for the first time since the gala, She wished she had not played that night, because survival had taught her that being right never competes with being unseen. Nathan came to the building because the idea of distance felt like another lie, and he took the stairs because waiting in the open for an elevator felt obscene. And when he reached her door, he did not knock at first because he knew the knock would ask for a story. Neither of them had chosen to rehearse. She opened it on the second sound of his hand because fear makes its own small bravado, and told him he should not be there. And he answered that he knew and stayed anyway, because knowing had not changed the price of leaving. In the room, the air had the thin metallic taste of adrenaline and tears that have not yet chosen their timeline, and she told him the words people used as if they had learned them together in a room she had never been invited into. And he said nothing until the story finished, and then spoke one sentence that did not carry solutions, but carried weight when he said they were wrong, and he would say so again wherever it was needed. She told him that saying would not stop a hand from throwing or a mouth from hunting, and he answered that he had already lost a contract and 2 bored allies, and that he would lose more because the truth had never been expensive to him before, and he needed to learn what expensive meant now. The admission did not comfort her, but it strange steadied the room because it named a cost that was not just hers to bear. When she finally let herself sit, the tears arrived with the density of long work, and she covered her face with hands that still remembered the keys they would not touch, and Nathan stood a careful distance away until she dropped one hand and let his sleeve be passable ground without asking for rescue. Outside, a neighbor argued into a phone about a story that had nothing to do with her children and everything to do with a name that was suddenly familiar for the wrong reasons. And inside, Lena said she could not leave the room again, and Nathan said she would not have to, that he would handle the place where her safety should not need an audience. The next morning, he went to the networks with no rehearsal and no paint over consequence, and named the story as a lie, and the room went quiet in ways that frighten the people who trade in noise, and the investors responded with the arithmetic of trust withdrawn and futures postponed, and a partner walked away that afternoon with a contract that would have rewritten a quarter, and Nathan accepted the loss with the same calm he had once used to justify safer choices. When it was over, she asked him why he had done it, and he said because the world already knew what it thought of her, and he could not let it confuse his silence with consent again, and the sentence took root between them as a shelter not yet built but already imagined. By midnight, the feed slowed from frenzy into repetition, and the day folded back into itself with a bruise that would change color over time, but not be mistaken for healing yet. And Lena fell asleep in a chair with the phone unlit, and the sound she had made hidden again under night that learned her breathing by heart. The stage she almost ran from waited for her in a small converted loft on the Lower East Side, where brick sweated history, and the ceiling hung low enough to make every sound feel accountable, and the chairs were arranged in imperfect rows, as if the room itself did not trust symmetry anymore after what the internet had done to her name. And Lena stood in the doorway with the distant pulse of traffic threading through her ribs like doubt with a steady tempo. The showcase had been announced quietly, and then nearly canceled quietly too, when the venue manager panicked at the first anonymous threat that arrived in an inbox shaped like concern. and Nathan had taken the call with a stillness that did not hide the edge in his voice, saying that if fear chose the program tonight, then fear would begin to own more than just the music. She heard about the near cancellation after the fact, when Raoul slipped her a folded flyer, with his hand still shaking, from a fear he could not admit, to holding, and the sight of her own name printed in clean type made the room tilt the way it had, before a performance when she was young enough to trust applause and old enough to know its price. She told Nathan on the phone that she could not do it, that the room would swallow her again with a different mouth, and that the past was already loud enough without inviting witnesses. And he listened without argument till the word forever appeared between their pauses, and then he answered with a sentence that cut through the noise, because it was not grand or noble and did not promise safety, saying if you run tonight, they will own this fear forever, and they will spend it however they like. The truth of it struck her with the dull weight of something she had always known and chosen to maneuver around rather than confront, and she hung up without agreeing and sat on her bed with the saxophone case open at her feet, as if the instrument were a question she had left unanswered too long to pretend it forgot how to speak. In the hours before the show, the city returned to her like a memory, learned by muscle rather than mind. The bus rattling its regular route through winter light. The smell of roasted nuts on the corner where a man hummed in a register too low for commerce, and the sidewalks practicing indifference with the intimacy of repetition. And when she reached the loft, the door was already open, and the sound inside had not yet chosen a shape. A handful of students warmed their hands with nervous laughter, and a woman with tired eyes tuned a guitar with care that did not rush, and a man leaned against a column with a notebook he kept closing as if the act of writing now felt louder than listening. And Nathan stood at the back, without ceremony, as if he were another piece of furniture the room would accept if it decided to. Lena took one step into the space and felt the full argument of her body unfold in a sentence, made of breath and memory and refusal, and she nearly turned when a voice behind her said softly that the chairs were not for cameras tonight. They were for people who still believed that sound could be held without being owned. She did not ask who had said it, because asking would make it a promise, and she was done with promises she could not price. Backstage was nothing more than a narrow hall with a cracked mirror and a table that held water and 3 folded programs. And when she closed the door, the past pressed closer, without ceremony, showing her the night she had kept playing through sirens, and the morning she had stopped playing because the cost had finally arrived in a form she could no longer negotiate. Her hands trembled, and she sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and felt the old argument begin that told her she was safer as an outline than an object, safer as a rumor than a risk, safer as a waitress who carried other people. Answers across the room than as a musician who asked questions with a voice she did not control. A knock came, and Nathan said her name once with the quality of a question that does not demand an answer, but waits for one honestly. And in that pause, the choice she had been postponing presented itself with the steady patience of a door that had always known it would be used or refused on the same terms in the end. She opened it, and the look they exchanged carried the weather of the week without summaries, and he did not talk about courage or destiny or any of the words that had betrayed them both. Already he only said that whatever she chose, he would not translate it into strategy afterward, and the promise mattered because it was small enough to keep. When the host called her name without announcement, the room stilled with a shared uncertainty that did not yet know whether it had been invited to hope, and Lena stepped into the light with a steadiness born not of fearlessness, but of exhaustion with hiding, and the saxophone felt heavier than it had the first night, because it now carried consequence as well as memory. The first note did not leap, it tested the air, and the air accepted it with a softness that told her the room was listening and not hunting. And the second note answered with a warmth that surprised her into trust before she could prepare against it. She played the melody that had argued itself into being between her and Nathan in the nights of tension and apology and small steadiness, and the sound carried the shape of fear without disguising it as beauty, and carried the ache of wanting without promising relief too early. And as the phrases took on weight and direction, she felt the audience settle into the work of attention rather than the sport of consumption. Halfway through, a woman in the front row closed her eyes and breathed as if remembering a room she had not known she missed, and a student in the back wiped his cheek without embarrassment, because the embarrassment had been elsewhere long enough to tire of itself, and the sound grew into its own permission not to be perfect and not to ask forgiveness for that fact. Lena felt the past lean in the way. Storms sometimes lean before deciding where to spend their violence, and she kept playing through the lean as she hadn't done before, because the room was not asking her to sacrifice anything in exchange for sound. Now the room was receiving. When the last note faded, there was silence, not because no one knew how to respond, but because the response required a breath they had not yet taken. And in the back, Nathan felt the burn behind his eyes that he had once endured as threat, and now endured as proof that something had reached him without asking what he could pay. The applause arrived finally, not as a rush but as a gathering that lifted together and broke gently against the brick, and he did not move because movement would have made it less true, and Lena stood without a bow because the sound had already done what it had come to do, and she would not diminish it with gesture. Backstage, she folded in on herself with the delayed shake that often follows survival, and pressed her forehead against the wall as if to thank it for standing, and Nathan met her there without words, because some sentences need time to decide whether they will exist at all. The night did not erase the fear, but it changed its outline, and that was enough to keep her from running for one more hour. And in that hour she learned that the stage could be a place where the past arrived and left without collecting rent if the room was small enough and the listening was steady enough to hold without owning. The song that started as a fight began on a night when neither of them arrived at the diner with the right words, and both arrived carrying the wrong weather, and the room felt it. Before any sentence made, the tension public as cups landed too hard and orders traveled too fast, and the small shared patience they had built learned the taste of impatience without warning. Nathan had spent the afternoon fielding calls that wanted to turn the showcase into leverage, and he had refused them with a heat that still lived in his jaw, and Lena had spent the day dodging messages from people who called her brave as if the word were currency and did not require another person to spend it with you when the room went dark again. When they met behind the counter between shifts, the look they traded carried accusation without language and relief, without permission, and she said he had no right to decide how loudly the world would answer her, and he said she had no right to disappear with decisions that braided their lives without discussion, and the words fell wrong because they were both right about the wrong parts. The argument moved them into the narrow after hours, quiet with the door locked, and the sign turned because the night had already proven that listening did not require witnesses, and the first true sentence landed when she told him that control was the language that had already killed one man she loved, and she would not be raised in its grammar again. He answered with the truth he had learned too slowly, that he did not know how to build safety without control, and that the absence of it made him feel like a boy counting storms alone. And the confession hit the room harder than anything they had said before, because fear rarely looks like fear when it is trying to keep its job. She told him that hiding had kept her alive, and he told her that hiding had taught him nothing about life except how to avoid it. And for a long breath, the room balanced those sentences, like weights that did not match, but still demanded the same bar. The fight did not break into shouting because they were both too practiced at restraint to waste what they were risking now on volume alone, and instead it sharpened into the kind of quiet that presses truth out of bodies without offering theater as a distraction. When she turned away first, it was not retreat, but necessity, and she went to the piano with a hand that shook as if it were newly learning to be a hand again. And Nathan followed to the edge of the light without asking permission, because the door had already been closed behind them, and the question had chosen its arena. She sat and struck one note that did not yet belong to the song, and it rang like the opening of an argument that had hidden inside her ribs for years, and she struck another that answered it with refusal, and a third that wanted to negotiate, and the sound built a grammar they could both hear without agreeing on its meaning yet. He said that what she was doing was not fair because it moved him without asking, and she said that nothing about truth asks first, and he laughed without humor because he had built an empire on asking later. She played louder, not as threat, but as defense, and the chord that rose between them carried the ache of wanting to stay without the permission of certainty. And for an instant, the fight widened into something that could have swallowed the room and ended the story where it stood. Instead, he stepped closer into the field of sound and said that he was afraid of the future she wanted because it had no bars to measure, and she said she was afraid of the future he learned because it would always find a way to put a price on her breath. The notes twisted around those fears and learned a direction they had not been given, as if the argument itself had taught them where to go, and he found himself humming without deciding to, because the line had offered a place his voice could stand without claiming the center. The first lyric escaped him, not as poetry, but as a sentence he had never said out loud. I do not know how to want without a ledger, and the room accepted it as if it were a confession worth keeping, and she answered it with a run that carried her fear forward, without disguising it as bravado. They worked against each other at first with melody and breath crossing like weather systems that do not intend to meet but cannot help it, and the friction heated into something that asked for hands rather than distance. And when the song bent toward a bridge neither of them had planned, they stopped at once, because planning had not earned the right to lead tonight. The silence that followed was not an ending, but a cliff, and she felt the pull to jump, and he felt the pull to calculate the wind. And between those instincts, the truth pressed through that neither of them could finish this without being changed. She told him she would not be converted into inspiration, and he told her he would not convert her into anything at all. And the promise did not settle, because promises never do on first hearing. But the ground shifted enough to try again. They returned to the beginning, not to repeat it, but to forgive it, and the notes learned patience, where they had learned defiance, and the lyric that followed did not barter with fear, but named it as a companion rather than a master. By the time the melody resolved for the first time, the fight had changed shape into work, and the work had changed shape into something that could be shared without losing its teeth. She pressed the final phrase into the room with a palm that no longer trembled, and he answered it with a harmony that did not try to overtake or correct, and the sound they made together surprised them with its refusal to choose a winner. When it ended, they stood with their backs to the quiet and felt the burn in their throats that comes from having told something that waited a long time to be told, and the closeness between them tested its own grammar with the heat of proximity and the choice not to lean on it yet. He said that the song sounded like a place you arrive at without permission, and she said it sounded like staying without apology, and they smiled because the difference did not ask to be buried. Outside, a siren passed without cutting the room, and she noticed that for the first time and felt the old memory fail to claim the sound as its property. They did not touch when the night released them, because touch would have ended the argument with a word they were not ready to own. And instead they gathered the music and left it on the stand the way one leaves a fire, banked rather than extinguished, so that morning can decide what to do with it. On the street, the air was colder than either of them expected, and they stood at a distance that honored what had not yet crossed between them, and he asked if she wanted a ride, and she said she wanted to walk, and he did not insist because insisting had already broken tonight once. As she turned away, she looked back only once and said that the fight had been necessary, and he answered that he was beginning to understand why the songs that last do not begin in agreement, and the sentence kept them both awake longer than the sound they had made together, because it named a future that neither of them could own alone. The performance that broke and healed her unfolded on a night that refused spectacle and chose patience instead, as the small hall filled without fanfare and without banners and without the hunger that had followed her name days before. And Lena stood behind the curtain with the saxophone cool against her palm and the echo of the fight-born song resting in her chest like a question that had learned how to breathe on its own. The lights were low and honest, the kind that do not flatter or accuse, and the audience settled into their chairs with the soft sound of coats and programs and uncertainty that had chosen to wait rather than demand. And somewhere near the back, Nathan took a seat with his hands folded the way he did when he wanted to disappear into listening rather than presence. Lena closed her eyes once and felt the old habit of counting exits flicker and fade, because the room had already told her it had no need of traps tonight. And when she stepped into the light, she did not bow or scan faces for signs of danger, because she had learned from the stage she almost ran from, that sometimes survival is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it choose the tempo. The first note left her in a narrow ribbon that carried neither bravado nor apology, only breath shaped into sound, and it moved through the room without asking for permission, the way truth had done for her in the narrow hall when words finally claimed their weight. She followed that note with another that carried memory without the sharp edge of debt, and the phrase that grew from them held the ache of the city at night when windows become mirrors, and mirrors become witnesses, and the silence that received it did not try to hurry her toward anything she had not yet earned. Halfway through the opening passage, she felt the old tremor rise, and instead of fighting it, she let it travel through her hands and into the keys, where it softened into a vibrato that made the sound human and breakable, and therefore real, and someone in the front row inhaled, as if the room itself had become a single lung learning a new rhythm. She had expected the moment of collapse, the one that used to arrive, when the past leaned too hard against her ribs and demanded payment in panic. But it did not come with teeth tonight. It arrived instead as heat that spread slowly across her back and warmed rather than burned. And she learned in that instant that the difference between breaking and opening is often only the direction of the force. The fight-born song waited in the middle of the set without introduction, and when she turned toward it, the audience answered with a hush that felt less like suspense than like consent, and as she set the shape of the first bars in motion, she felt Nathan in the room, not as a presence she had to navigate, but as a gravity that did not pull her off center. The melody carried the argument they had traded without the language that had cut them both, and the line he had hummed returned to her in a softened register that no longer wanted to prove anything. And when she reached the place where her fear had once demanded retreat, she held the note instead and felt the room hold it with her, until it resolved into something that did not need to be explained. In that held breath, she saw her father not on the road that had taken him, but on a small stage. She had once known where he had lifted his horn and called a room to attention with the unsteady authority of a man who believed that sound was the one promise he could keep, and the image did not ask her to follow him into loss tonight. It only asked her to remember the part of herself that had learned courage before it learned consequence. The audience did not know they were carrying that memory with her now, but they carried it anyway, in the way their bodies leaned without pressure, and their eyes softened without the hunger of judgment. And she felt the truth settle, that music does not belong to grief forever unless the living abandon it to that fate. When she reached the last movement, she did not rush toward the finish, because she had learned that endings arrive whether or not you try to outrun them, and that the cruelty lies not in their arrival, but in the speed with which one abandons oneself to meet them. And she let the final phrases unfurl with the patience of someone who had chosen to stay. The final note did not land as a declaration, but as an exhale, and the room answered with a quiet that did not require instruction, because it understood what had been offered and did not want to spoil it with reflex. And in that quiet, she felt the break complete, not as a shattering, but as a seam opening wide enough to relieve the pressure that had lived under her skin for years. The applause that followed did not break the spell. It carried it forward in a different register, and she allowed herself to receive it without translating it into debt or obligation, because the room had not asked her to earn safety with performance tonight. she stepped back from the stand and met Nathan's eyes across the distance they had learned not to rush, and saw there not rescue or possession, but the steady recognition of someone who had been changed without needing to claim the change as his own. And the exchange lifted something between them that neither had known how to set down before. Backstage, she sat with her back against the wall and felt the delayed tremble arrive at last and pass through her without apology and without resistance. And when Nathan appeared in the doorway, he did not speak until she looked up, because some conversations begin only after the body agrees that it has survived. He said that she had not only faced the room she had taught it how to listen, and she said that he had not tried to shape the night into proof, and that this restraint had been a different kind of courage than she had learned to expect, and the words settled between them without argument. Outside the hall, the city kept its ordinary pace, and a man sold pretzels with the certainty that hunger would outlast any story, and a busker tuned a guitar without knowing who had played inside and why. And Lena noticed the sound of him adjusting strings, not as a threat, but as a continuation. When they walked into the street together, there were no cameras waiting, and the absence felt like a gift rather than a loss. And she said that something had broken in her tonight that had needed to break, and he said that something had healed in him that he had once tried to automate, and the difference between the two felt suddenly intimate rather than dangerous. They did not kiss because the night had already named enough. Without adding a language, their bodies were still learning to trust, and instead they stood under a light that flickered without asking to be fixed, and listened to the city answer itself with the small, unpriced sounds of footsteps and engines and wind through paper. She told him she was not afraid of the stage in that room anymore, and he told her that he was afraid of the old rooms he had called power, because they were suddenly too small, and the fear did not push them apart, because it had finally been named as something they could carry together without making it a weapon. When they parted at the corner, she felt the quiet after music not as an emptiness, but as a ground that had been turned and left ready for whatever would choose to grow there next. And he walked away with the knowledge that for the first time he did not want to manage the future ahead of him. He wanted to meet it at the speed of breath and choice, and the small, unpredictable courage that had entered his life without permission and taught him how to listen. The studio did not arrive as a grand unveiling, but as a sequence of ordinary permissions that kept choosing yes over delay until the space learned a new name through use rather than announcement. And the first permission was Nathan's quiet decision to sell a portion of what had once defined him so completely that he had mistaken ownership for identity, a decision that traveled through boardrooms with the soft shock of something that could not be optimized without losing its point. He did it without spectacle and without press, because the work no longer needed an audience to be real for him. And when his former partners asked what problem he was solving, he answered that some problems ask not to be solved, but to be held differently. And the answer cost him invitation he would once have measured as losses and now measured as room. The building they chose was on a street that taught patience with chipped paint and afternoon light, and the echo of delivery trucks that paused long enough to learn its new name as the place where sound gathered without asking permission to last. And Lena stood in the doorway the first morning with a set of keys that felt heavier than the saxophone had ever felt, because the weight carried the promise of return, not the risk of disappearance. The rooms were bare at first, and the walls answered footsteps with a hollow question. But the question did not frighten her because she had learned that emptiness can be a form of invitation when it is chosen. And she began to imagine the music that would live there in layers that did not depend on her to be the center. They painted the walls a color that held light without throwing it back, and the neighborhood kids gathered to argue about whether the corner should be blue or green, as if the argument were already a rehearsal for listening. And Nathan watched from the sidewalk with his sleeves rolled and his phone silent for the first time in years, not as a strategy, but as a preference that had learned its own reasons to be. The first piano arrived on a borrowed truck with a bench that wobbled and a history that did not ask to be untangled for it to sing again. And Elena laid her palms on the lid and felt the old tremor pass without claiming her hands as its territory. And she knew then that she would teach here not to save anyone, but to remain faithful to the sound that had carried her back, to a room she had not thought she would ever enter without bracing. The neighborhood came in waves that did not need invitation. Once the door learned how to stay open, and a boy with a cracked trumpet learned the discipline of breath, and a girl who had been told too many times that her voice was too much learned, that too much becomes just right when the room is large enough to let it spread. And Lena learned the humility of watching someone else discover a note without needing to borrow her history to justify it. Nathan came when he could and listened with a notebook that remained mostly empty now because listening had begun to do the work he once demanded from language. And when he did write, it was not to capture, but to remember, which are different verbs with different costs. The choice that changed everything did not announce itself with a deadline, but grew the way weather does with small daily pressures, until Lena recognized it as the question she had been living inside without naming for weeks. And she found him late one evening, tuning a violin with a child who would not be corrected out of curiosity alone, and waited until the instrument answered and the room returned to its ordinary breath. She told him then that she did not want the studio to be theirs as a monument or a symbol, and that she did not want their story to be used as proof that pain has returns on investment. And he said that he had learned the danger of building monuments to change rather than building roofs over it, and the understanding settled between them without the need for signatures. Later that night, as they walked the long way back, through streets that had learned their footsteps, she told him that she was afraid not of the stage anymore, but of what comes after when the crowd leaves, and the quiet asks what you will be without witnesses. And he answered that he had built a life around witnesses and still felt alone in rooms that applauded, and that being unwitnessed with her felt strangely like presence rather than absence. They stopped at a corner where the light lingered long enough for a decision to collect itself, and she said that she did not want a public promise, and he said that he did not trust promises that perform, and they stood long enough for the city to practice its indifference around them until the quiet promise chose them without needing words. The seasons learned the studio next and renamed it in small ways, as winter gave it the work of keeping sound warm, and spring gave it the work of letting doors stay open longer without argument, and summer brought the small, trying audacity of students who believed that the room would hold them even when their notes did not, and Lena believed it with them without turning herself into a story they had to echo. The work changed Nathan in ways he could not grasp, and the change did not ask his permission to continue, and his sleep steadied without the scaffolding of devices that once told him when to rest and when to rise, and he learned the cost of being needed in ways that cannot be delegated without becoming less than they were. Sometimes he stood in the back and watched Lena teach and wondered at the steadiness of her hands that had once shaken only with fear and now shook only with weather and time. And he learned that seeing without taking is another grammar the body can learn when the mind stops demanding proof. The past did not vanish as a condition of the new work, and she encountered it sometimes in the eyes of those who had been told that survival must look a certain way to be legitimate, and she learned to answer them with the consistency of presence rather than the spectacle of defense, and the rumors lost their force when they were not fed by her attention. Raoul visited on a quiet afternoon with pastries he claimed had been purchased accidentally, and stayed long enough to hear a boy struggle toward a phrase and arrive with sweat on his brow and wonder in his eyes. And he clapped without irony and told her that the room sounded like the kind of future he had hoped the diner would be, without ever knowing how to build it. And she answered that rooms teach us what they can if we teach them how to listen. The quiet promise they had chosen did not protect them from fear entirely, and there were nights when the old grammar reached for them again, as habit reaches for hands in the dark. And on those nights they returned to the studio and let the instruments speak where they could not, without trying to name what would not stay still long enough to be named. One evening, when the city pressed heat against the windows and thunder waited its turn, they sat at opposite ends of the piano and played a phrase back and forth, without deciding where it would go, and the room learned them again, without asking for conclusion, and in the middle of the exchange, she laughed with the free surprise of someone who has accepted that joy can arrive without credentials, and he laughed back with the shock of hearing himself unguarded. The quiet promise was not announced and did not need to be defended, because it grew in habits that chose one another in small ways, that outlasted language the way he brought water without being asked, and the way she touched his sleeve when she passed, not as a claim, but as punctuation, and the way they let absence speak, when they did not know how to fill it without breaking what had carried them this far. When the first public recital arrived, it did not carry the hunger of proof, and the audience was built of parents and neighbors and strangers, who had learned to trust the room without knowing its history. And Lena introduced the students without listing her own, and watched them take the stage with the particular gravity of people who have learned that sound is both a risk and a refuge. Nathan stood at the back and did not calculate the room, and did not need to, because the room had already learned its value in use. And when the last child finished to applause that did not demand an encore, Lena felt the echo of her own first performance somewhere deep and distant, and did not have to answer it with dread. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the chairs returned to their imperfect rows, she found him by the door with the expression he wore when he was listening without an assignment, and she told him that she was ready to choose not the future as a plan, but the present as a place, to remain attentive, and he answered that he would choose it with her, without promising what attentiveness would require tomorrow. The choice felt like a threshold that did not announce itself with a change in lighting, but it altered the temperature of the room in ways that could be felt without being measured, and they crossed it side by side without naming the act, because names can hurry what must be learned at the speed of breath. Outside the street carried the ordinary music of evening, and the studio windows held a soft reflection that did not put either of them at the center. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt the quiet after sound, not as the beginning of an argument with memory, but as a rest that had earned its place. The promise they kept was not to remain unchanged, but to return to the work with attention when the change asked for it. And as they turned off the lights together, the room kept a small charge of warmth, as if to say that what had been built here would not vanish with darkness, but would wait in the way instruments do for hands that arrive without hurry and without fear of what the first note might ask them to feel. If this story moved you even a little, take a second to let me know where you are listening from right now, because every time you type a city or a country into the comments, it reminds us that these quiet stories travel farther than we ever imagine. And if Lena and Nathan made you feel something real, whether it was hope, sadness, courage, or even hesitation, comment one word that describes what stayed with you the longest after the final note faded. If you believe that healing does not always arrive as a miracle, but sometimes arrives as a room, a sound, a person who stays, when it would be easier to leave than tap the like button gently, like placing a hand on a piano key without rushing the next note. And if you want to hear more stories like this about broken beginnings, second chances, quiet love, and the kind of courage that grows slowly over time, then subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter that might find you exactly when you need it. Share this story with someone who is afraid to be seen, someone who once loved something deeply and stopped, or someone who needs to remember that it is never too late to begin again without apology. We read every comment, and many of the stories you will hear next are born directly from the words you leave behind here. So your voice truly matters in this space. Thank you for listening with your heart. Thank you for staying through the quiet parts, and thank you for believing that stories like this still have a place in a loud world. I will see you in the next one.